This is The Road Show, and I'm your host, David Warren. On today's program, we're going to travel halfway around the world in our minds and in our hearts to the country of China, a mysterious land for most of us, and a land where God is moving, just as He is here in the United States. Our guest today is Jonathan Brooks, president of Voice of China and Asia Missionary Society, and he's here to give us the rest of the story about China, a story which we don't always hear or read about in the news. At this time, let's welcome Jonathan Brooks. Good to have you, Jonathan.
Great. Thank you, David. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
You know, when I'm going to interview a new guest, because this is your first time on this particular program, I memorize the guest's name so I don't embarrass myself. And it was very easy in our case with the Jonathan and David combo here.
Oh, yeah, that's true. It is.
So
yeah,
it's good to have you with us today.
Thank you.
Okay, let's start out with a little game here.
Okay.
All right, this program airs at 12 noon Central.
Sure.
How many times have you been to China, by the way?
22, 23 times.
Okay, let's say it's one of your 23 times. It's high noon in China. What would you be doing right now?
Well, when you visit with the Chinese, they always treat you like the honored guest. And whether it's noontime or dinner time, they're always going to treat you with a feast. And it'll be the best that they have. If you're in rural China, it'll be their best. And if it's in a city place, you're going to be in a nice restaurant.
Okay, let's say you're in rural China. What kind of protein will you have?
Probably fish.
Okay.
Yeah.
I assume rice.
Always rice. Always rice. That's the main. Your bowl will be filled with rice first.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you go to a quote unquote Chinese restaurant, let's say here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, is that anything like what you would have?
No, it's always a disappointment to come home when it comes to food. It's great to see family. It's great to be with friends again, but it's always a disappointment to come back to American Chinese food. Even the restaurants here will tell us that they kind of gear their food towards Americans.
Well, the word China and the whole culture and history of China has been a part of your life since you were born.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
So you're really binational in a way.
Well, we'd like to think so. We kind of think it's in our blood since we're the third generation now running the ministry. So we just really feel a connection to China.
The ministry that you're referring to, I said it in the intro, but again, the name of it is Voice of China and Asia Missionary Society. So you come from a family of missionaries, and you just mentioned that you're third generation. And we're going to talk about what is taking place in the current era, the modern era,
Sure.
in China, and how you are reaching that land for Jesus Christ. But you have a rich family history, and it starts back in 1909, and this should be interesting trying to get in 100-plus years in this hour, but let's do our best. Tell us how this all got started, and I love the fact it got started with a one-way ticket for your grandparents. I mean, they were committed.
Oh, they certainly were, yes. There was quite a call for China. Hudson Taylor had been traveling the world trying to get missionaries to come to China. He passed away in 1906. Not long after that, there was a powerful move of the Holy Spirit, kind of based in Los Angeles at Azusa Street. Mm-hmm. My grandparents were profoundly affected by that, and they felt the call to China. And so they left for China, and they teamed up with another couple who had been called to China once they got there, and the work has continued. Now we're in our 114th year, and ever since my grandparents left for China, we've had a continual presence in Asia, either in China or some other Asian nation.
Tell us about your first trip to China. I assume it was when you were very young.
Yeah, it was 1982. I had gotten a job with the airlines because I thought that I'd never be able to afford a ticket to Asia. And so as soon as I could, I flew to Hong Kong and saw the works that my uncle had been doing in Hong Kong and their churches, their orphanages. And we took a day trip from Macau into China, and it was purely communist China that we saw at that time.
Your grandparents, their last name is Wrighton.
Yes.
The Wrightons. So
Yeah.
this, again, was back in 1909. One-way ticket. Folks, can you imagine pre-television, really not quite knowing what they were getting themselves into? They were just following the call of God.
That's right. Yeah. And they landed with $40 in their pocket.
Oh, my goodness. With no job.
No job, just trusting God.
Well, tell us a story or two.
Wow, it was quite a story. They had to find their place. They knew God had called them. And when God called back then, people just left. And like, God called me to China, let's go. And they left. And it's just amazing what people did by faith and trusting God back then. They worked in an orphanage. They found a place in an orphanage where there was a need. And so they moved there, and it was up the Pearl River is all I know from Hong Kong. And they eventually, within 5 years, had settled back in Hong Kong and started a work that's continued to this day.
So back in 1909, what percentage, if any, of the nation of China was Christian? Did it exist?
Yeah, Christianity did exist. The first missionaries came about 1820.
Okay.
Were some of the first missionaries into China. And that missionary was one who, Robert Morrison, he was the one who actually created the first Chinese Bible.
Really?
Yeah. It was quite a story. He took his King James Bible and opened it up, and as he learned Chinese, he just translated his King James Bible into Chinese. And that was the main Bible for China for almost 100 years.
Wow. So tell us about the living conditions for your grandparents.
The living conditions were pretty. Nobody wanted to rent to them at first because they were outsiders, they were foreigners. This was the era of the Boxer Rebellion, where outsiders were considered foreign devils. And in fact, my grandparents were often awakened early in the morning when the street vendors were saying, wake up, it's time to take off the heads of the foreign devils. And rather than run, they realized that that was their challenge, to touch these people for Christ. So really, nobody wanted to rent to them. To rent would mean that you were corroborating with the evil ones, with the invaders. And so they didn't trust them, and so nobody wanted to rent to them. At one point, Reverend Wrighton was shown a place where he could stay for the night, and he realized when he woke up that he was laying on top of a pigsty, on boards covering a pigsty. So it was pretty tough. And then floods would come, and then they realized that those conditions in rural China like that were just too much, and they had to move into the Hong Kong area.
What did they do for fellowship?
It's real interesting because no matter what your denomination was, missionaries clung together. Very tight fellowship was very common. And in fact, they paid their tithes to each other when they were able to have anything to give. If there was anything not left over, they were always willing to share what they had with other missionaries. So they were a very tight bond amongst all missionaries of all denominations back then.
Okay, so it sounds like that they were embraced by a group of existing missionaries when they arrived.
Definitely.
Oh, thank goodness.
Yeah. It was always special when a new boat would arrive in the harbor because they were hoping that new missionaries would come and help with the work. The work was so vast.
I wonder if when they signed up to go to China, if they were told just get a one-way ticket, because I'm sure that there would be a temptation to want to come back home pretty quickly.
They went to die.
Oh, really?
They went to give their lives for Christ. It didn't matter. Coming home didn't matter to them. They went to give their lives for Christ.
Where did that go? I don't hear people talking like that anymore, Jonathan.
You don't. Yeah, we have credit cards now.
We have a backup plan as well.
We have a backup plan. You can always get home. And if that doesn't cover it, insurance will. They'll evacuate you. But they went to give their lives for Christ. And the dedication to the Lord was just unreal. Really helps us search our hearts when we read about their adventures.
I trust that there are special rewards in heaven for people like your grandparents who really sold out for the message of Jesus Christ and to win the world, the whole world?
Well, I think their reward came when somebody would give their life to Christ on the field. That made it all worth it, all the pain, all the suffering that they went through. You know, another thing, you asked about the conditions, and I remember reading one article where they said if we could just afford to buy some protein. They were living off rice, and sometimes when the rice would run out, maybe tea or something like that. But they said we could do so much more if we just had some protein. It's just insight into the lives that they had to live as early missionaries in Hong Kong.
Jonathan Brooks is with us. He is the current president of the Voice of China and Asia Missionary Society, and we're talking about his grandparents right now, plus your aunt and uncle then took over after they...
Yes, they were the second generation.
Okay, second generation, or uncle and aunt.
Yeah.
And they are, or were, the Hammonds.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, so let's hear about the Hammonds, because we're going to hear a clip from your uncle coming up here in just a bit that I think our listeners will find quite interesting.
Sure, yeah. Well, the Hammonds, my uncle Bob Hammond and his wife Helen, they were friends as children on the field, and of course, my uncle's first language was Chinese, and so they had that bond together. My family came home because of tropical disease. Eventually they had to, or life was going to be over. But when Helen Hammond came to the United States to go to college, my uncle met the boat, and they both went to Pasadena College together. And upon graduation, they got married and went back to Hong Kong to help the Writons in the work back there.
Excellent. Hey, before we go to break, you brought a Bible in Chinese.
Yes.
I mean, I'm assuming that's a Bible and that's in Chinese. It looks like Chinese to me.
Sure.
Tell us about the translation of the King James Bible into Chinese. When did that take place?
Well, that was in 1820 with Robert Morrison.
Okay.
Yeah. And he said he knew it was not a good translation. He was a novice with the language, but he was doing his best. And so for the first 100 years of missionary work inside China, people were kind of searching for a real good translation, and that was quite a prayer need, that China would have a good Bible translation.
So how's your Chinese?
Very limited. I have such good interpreters.
Now, do you know a Bible verse in Chinese?
No, but I could say, God bless you, Shandi Jufuni. And some people say Shen Jufuni, because the Chinese had two different words for God. And Shandi is the highest God. And so there's Bible translations where in one translation it says Shen is the name for God, and the other one is Shangdi is the name for God. So you'll find both used.
Now, I assume that your grandparents and then your aunt and uncle, they did have to learn Chinese.
Yes, they did. Yeah, in fact, Chinese was the language of the household.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well,
Wrighton, if I could say, Wrighton, as he went into old age and came back to the States, he reverted to Chinese only. And he was in a South Dakota nursing home, and nobody could talk to him. He wouldn't talk to anybody. They finally had a Chinese worker come in, and he spoke only Chinese to her.
Wow.
Yeah, it went out of the head and into the heart.
Well, we're going to talk about another book besides the Bible coming up, and it's called Bondservants, the story of the voice of China and Asia. And what we're going to focus on from this book is the fact that both your grandparents and then your aunt and uncle were put in a prisoner. They were prisoners of war. They were put in a prison camp.
Yes, that's right.
And so we want to know what that experience was like for your family, and then we want to know all about what's going on today through the ministry of Voice of China and Asia Missionary Society under your leadership, Jonathan Brooks. I'm David Warren, your host, and we'll both be back after this. I'm David Warren, here with some exciting news for Oasis listeners. We have a new mobile device app. It's free, easy to download, and lets you enjoy our refreshing music and talk everywhere you go. If you have an Android cell phone, go to the Google Play Store. And if you have an iPhone or iPad, visit the Apple Store and search for Oasis Radio Network. Be an Oasis ambassador and share this news with family and friends around the world.
I came to this place from a dry, thirsty land. I found an oasis of love. Oasis Network.
Greetings, friends, and welcome to the Voice of China and Asia broadcast with Bob and Helen Hammond.
Work for tonight is coming. Work through the morning hours. Work while the dew is sparkling. Work midst springing flowers.
That is the intro to the Voice of China and Asia radio broadcast hosted by Bob Hammond, the uncle of my very special guest today, who is Jonathan Brooks, president of Voice of China and Asia Missionary Society. And that radio broadcast was on the air for 46 years,
Yes,
Jonathan.
that's right. Yeah.
And before we started, you mentioned that most of our older listeners, at least, have heard that intro somewhere in the United States.
That's right. It used to be a nationwide broadcast.
Well, what happened is when we were preparing that clip, I listened to the rest of that particular broadcast from about 40 years ago, and your uncle started to tell the story of being a prisoner of war back in the early 1940s. And, I mean, there's nothing better than hearing it from the man himself. So we're going to play an extended clip from that particular broadcast we just heard the intro to, and then we'll talk about it, of course. But this was aired on October 30th, 1986, and again, this is Reverend Hammond sharing about his own life.
Greetings, friends. This is Bob Hammond, and as we bring you another broadcast, we pray for you, and we ask that you pray for us, for prayer changes things. I was called to China as a missionary, and I had a struggle as a teenager with a call. And finally I said, yes, Lord, I'll go to China if you will go with me. You see, my parents were faith missionaries. We lived by faith. And many a time, we only had 2 meals a day. There's a song written, where he leads me, I will follow. But there is a missionary version to that song. It says, what he feeds me, I will swallow. And it was as a teenager I learned what it meant to have the grace of the Lord to help us even while we ate. But, you know, we didn't starve, we didn't die. Yes, we went hungry. But I find now as I look back that hunger at times is a very good thing. At least it says that you're healthy. It does say you want something to eat. But when it keeps going on and on, you're hungry all the time. We're hearing so much about China today, and some of the news reports saying how everybody's working, everybody's fine. You know, if you had to be in China and you were working in a rice field and you realize that all the fertilizer of China does not go down the sewer or someplace, but it's all used, even the horses and the cows and the pigs and everything, for fertilizer. And you look over a rice field and you'll see maybe some of this in the TV reports where the Chinese are working so industriously and they're allowed to keep now some of their products. Under Mao Zedong, everything went to the government, and then they dished out a little to you, and if you didn't give everything to them, they killed you, or they worked you to death without anything to eat. Today, you are allowed to keep enough for the family and to eat and for your labors, and then go ahead and do the business of selling. But you see, before you can have anything to eat or product, you have to work for it. And so many millions of Chinese are farmers, and they use the water buffalo to plow the land. And as they work in the rice field, taking the rice plants, planting them by hand in all the rows, what do you think they're standing in all the time? And if you could go with me out to some of these areas that I've been to in the years gone by, you say, why don't you do it now? Because the farmers have been moved back and back and back and the land has been taken over by governments to build high-rise buildings and refugee camps, all the houses for the poor and those that don't have anything. So you could go with me, and if you did, out in the New Territory area, and you stayed overnight in one of the farmers' houses, and this is the same way in China, I don't think you could really, even now, any of you, except you who have lived there and come to America, can realize the simplicity of the Chinese people, of one small house to house several families, a 9-by-12 room having one family there sleeping on the floor. You have all of the pigs outside, and the ducks and chickens, and during the daytime they come in and they go out and so forth. You can't keep them out. The houses aren't strong enough. And they don't have enough barbed wire fences for all of that. But you get accustomed, I'm sure, when you live in the where the farmers are and out in the rice fields, you get accustomed to the fragrant odors. I put a quote and unquote on fragrant. After a while, you don't even notice that there are any odors. But you see, one thing about it, it does grow good rice. And friends, I've had the privilege in my 72 years of traveling, especially since 1939 when I finally was allowed by the Lord to have a wife and go out as a missionary to Hong Kong. And I was in a prison camp for 6 months, Stanley Prison in Hong Kong. And there we learned to survive. There we learned what hunger was. There we learned that every grain of rice is so important. There we learned that food had to be properly distributed. We learned that you just couldn't drink any kind of water. I don't know why, but somehow the Lord gave me a gift to talk to some of the men that were not Christians, to get into a fight to get all the Japanese guards over to stop the fight, and in the meantime, some of us little fellows would escape over the barbed wire down into the ocean front and bring up the salt water, and then we would take it on the roof where we'd put out a tin and put the water there. You know why? Because the water was evaporated and on the tin was left all the salt, so at least we had a little salt to put on our food because we had no flavorings, no salt or pepper or anything like that. And so you see, you learn under adverse conditions how to survive, just like the Israelites learned under Moses' leadership how to take the land in the name of God Almighty. And so today, I just want to tell you, I'm glad I'm alive. Helen and I supposed to have been dead 40 years ago, because when we were delivered from prison camp and come home on the Gripsome in the first exchange prisoners of war, we both had beriberi and pellagra. We were skin and bones. Everybody wanted me to come to their churches because they wanted to see what a skeleton looked like, I guess. I didn't know that at the time. But I did have a message. I had a story. And the story was that Jesus Christ never changes. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And though I walk through the valleys of the shadows of death, I'll fear no evil, for thou art with me. When you stand in front of machine guns to be shot, and somehow they never pull the trigger and you're alive. Yes, friends, I'm talking to you today from my heart to let you know that what the Lord did for me yesterday, He'll do for me today, and I don't have to worry about tomorrow, because the blood of Jesus Christ, God's Son, not only cleanses us, but then He sends His Holy Spirit, and He sends angels. Did you realize that? That the angels of the Lord encampeth around about those who love Him, and He delivereth them.
That is a clip from October 30th, 1986, the radio broadcast of Voice of China and Asia Missionary Society, and that is Bob Hammond, the president at that time, the second generation. I've got the third generation president with me today on the Road Show. I'm David Warren, talking with Jonathan Brooks. And by the way, for more information on this beautiful ministry, it's voiceofchinaandasia.com, voiceofchinaandasia.com. And you know, I've been in radio for about 40 years now, Jonathan, and there's just something special about that style of broadcasting that your uncle had. It's captivating.
He was a pioneer of Christian radio. Back in the 70s, there just weren't that many people on. You couldn't even find a Christian radio station back then. You had to buy time on a secular radio station.
Well, tell us about, or more about, this experience of being in a prisoner of war camp back in the early 1940s. Now, your uncle and aunt were put in prison.
That's right.
As well as your grandparents?
All of them, and other missionaries who were working with them in Hong Kong at the time.
Okay, now this was following the Japanese invasion of Hong Kong.
That's right. Many people don't realize that Hong Kong was bombed the same day Pearl Harbor was bombed. And so immediately our family went into hiding in an apartment behind the church. And after about 40 days or so, they realized that the people who were bringing them food were subjecting their lives to death. And so they realized that they can't put the believers that they love so much in these circumstances. And so they decided to surrender to the Japanese.
And were they arrested for being American?
Yeah, foreigners, yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. They turned themselves in. They came out of hiding in the apartment and turned themselves in, and they were escorted. They were told to gather their belongings as much as they can carry. They were allowed to take to the prison camp. And so they began a process of putting on just layers and layers and layers of clothes, everything that they could fit over whatever else they had on, and put things on little carts and things like that. Even their mattresses they carried to prison camp.
So when you were growing up, Jonathan, I'm sure you were mesmerized as a boy by these stories of your family members being in prison. Is this something that was difficult for them to talk about, being such a dark period in their life?
No, I think everybody was drawing it out of them. They wanted to know what was going on in China, and having experienced it firsthand, the Hammonds could certainly tell the story. He was exhausted from going to so many appointments. They couldn't keep all the appointments, and that's why a Jewish man suggested that they go on his radio station.
It's a lot easier to get into homes and cars. I mean, to get people's attention, it's a lot easier with radio and television, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
Speaking of that, and I want to go back to this being in prison, but what is the situation with Christian radio in China? Does it exist at all?
Oh, no, I don't believe it does. There are, if somebody has a shortwave radio, they might be able to capture something from the Far East Broadcasting Company. But that would be very rare for a rural believer to have a shortwave radio. I'm sure it exists, but other than that, there is no Christian broadcasting inside China. Some of the major churches during COVID were allowed to put their services on the internet because people could not come to church. But they realized that people stopped coming to church because they can listen to the broadcast online, so they stopped coming to church. So the church leaders decided to take that offline so that people would come back to church.
Well, I believe in both, so that's just my own personal opinion. But so how long was your family in this prisoner of war camp?
I believe it was about 7 months. And then the U.S. government and the Japanese government decided to exchange prisoners of war. And that's what brought them back to the States, is they were included in an exchange program. Americans were, but not the British. And the British, Hong Kong being a British colony at the time, the British suffered very severely after my uncle's departure, the Americans' departure.
Wow. So did they decide to come back to the United States, at least for a time?
Oh, definitely. They had no choice. They were put on a ship. It took them, of course, you had to be careful of the German U-boats in the Atlantic. And so they took them by way of Africa and then to Brazil and then up to New York, always cautious, knowing that the ship could be sunk.
This sounds like a movie to me.
It's very good material for a movie.
Well, maybe it should be called Bondservants, because that's the name of the book I'm holding in my hand. It's the story of the voice of China and Asia. And this is a book that you give to anybody who supports your ministry, and will tell you about how you are supporting the people of China with Bibles and other things that are very desperately needed. But this book, Bondservants, what can somebody read about in this particular book?
Well, it's their entire story from the beginning of God's call on their lives to China and answering the mission call. There was a great missions call to the whole world in the early 1900s. There had been a missions conference in Edinburgh in 1910, and they just realized that we can't wait for God to save all the sinners. We've got to spread the gospel. We've got to go ourselves. And then when the power of Pentecost came, people were willing to do anything for the Lord at that point.
I love that. Now, this book, again, is free to anybody who supports your ministry. And again,
Yes.
we'll tell how you are supporting people in China with your different outreaches. So how can people reach out to you and get a copy of Bondservants?
Oh, we'd love to hear from folks, especially if they've been a friend of the ministry in the past. And some people don't know that we still exist. So they're welcome to write to us. Our address is Post Office Box 70, 2015, Tulsa, Oklahoma, 74170. Or they're welcome to call our office at 877-392-0560.
And we have people tuned in really around the world, but mostly here in the United States. And, of course, anybody with internet access can go to your website, and that address, again, is?
voiceofchinaandasia.com.
And lots of lovely pictures on there.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah.
So when we come back, I'm going to talk with Jonathan Brooks about the fruit of both the Writons and the Hammonds, their time in China, and how this third generation of leadership headed by today's guest is not only carrying on their legacies, but continuing to win China for Christ. We'll both be back after this.
I'm Karen Jensen Salisbury, one of the hosts you hear on the Oasis Network Roadshow. For 35 years, this 1 hour of the day has inspired and motivated you, our listeners, with thousands of stories of people whose lives demonstrate the truth that with God, all things are possible. It's an hour that you should make a part of your day, Monday through Friday, starting at 1 p.m. Eastern, 12 noon Central. The Roadshow, an Oasis Network presentation.
Jonathan Brooks is my guest on today's Roadshow. I'm David Warren, your host, and I'm talking with Jonathan about leading a group called Voice of China and Asia Missionary Society. This group has been around for more than 100 years, reaching the nation of China with the good news of Jesus Christ. Again, to reach out to this ministry, you can go to the website voiceofchinaandasia.com, or you can call toll-free 1-877-392-0560, and anybody who supports the ministry and the different outreaches that they do. Again, we'll talk about those outreaches here in just a few moments. You get a complimentary copy of this book called Bondservants, the story of the voice of China and Asia. And you mentioned during the break just now that there's a good story in this book that you'd like to bring up at some point. So this is that point. What is the story, Jonathan?
Well, thank you, David. The story is this. Albert and Edna Wright, when they went to China, they went ready to give their lives. And within 2 years, Edna contracted black smallpox. But they didn't know it, and her health was failing, so they thought it was time to come home. They made it as far as Japan on the ship, and they realized she had to see a doctor, so they took her ashore. And that night, Edna's last words to Albert were this. She said, "My stay in China was short. Pray that my life will live on. Do all you can for China. Be faithful. Be true, and in a few more years we'll meet again." Well, as I was editing the Bondservants for modern publication, the book's been around since the mid-'40s, and so we had to update some things and put in new information. And when I got to this part, it says, "My stay in China was short. Pray that my life will live on." do all you can for China. That has really struck my heart. And I realized the Lord was speaking to me, that this wasn't just her words to her husband, but it was God's plan for me and my wife. Do all you can for China. And so we've continued the work since then, knowing that we have a purpose. We know exactly what we're to do. We're to do all we can for China. And there was a time later on where I felt like the Lord spoke to me a second time. And a local minister here in town, Jeff Jackson, was with me in China. And we were teaching Chinese how to use a pastor's study Bible. And he looked at them and he was talking about Timothy. And he said, don't quit. Don't quit. And he just kept repeating those words, don't quit. And there was about 800 Chinese pastors there. This is in central China. And in that event, I thought, you could feel a stirring going on in the meeting. And I started looking at the people. I thought, God's doing something big here. And Jeff Jackson just kept saying, don't quit, don't quit. And he pointed to different parts of the audience. And I just wanted to catch, I thought, man, maybe an angel's going to appear or something. I mean, this is so powerful. And so I started, as I looked around, I thought, God's talking to me. He's saying, don't quit. Don't quit. And the more he said it, the more it resonated with inside of me. The two things the Lord's told me, do all you can for China. And number two, don't quit.
Let's talk about what you are currently doing for the people of China. Actually, you're doing this for the Lord.
Sure.
And the people of China are the recipients of the calling of God on your life and on your wife's life.
Yeah.
And you know, for missionaries, you both have to be committed as a couple. Do you want to address that? Because I have served in short-term missions, and for a missionary couple to make it, you both have to have a calling to be there.
Yeah.
Or it works better, let's put it that way.
We're fortunate to be U.S.-based, and our work in China is short-term. So my wife can handle me being gone for short terms. We're on the field very frequently. So we really came to a decision when we decided when it was time to enter China once again for the ministry, because when communism took over, we didn't want the people to risk their lives to be in contact with us. So since 1949, all the way through recent times, 2009, we were the voice of China and Asia, but we weren't actually involved in China in an open way, in a way that we could report. I had just become a father at age 48 for the first time. And at the time we had a 1-year-old son. And following the Lord's command to do what we can for China, I thought certainly the Lord didn't want me to be a father at this late age, for me to be absent and in a Chinese prison the rest of my life. It didn't make sense. And nor did it make sense for me to ask our partners to raise ransom money to get me out of prison. I thought, Lord, that doesn't make sense. Is there something we can do legally inside China? And somebody told me that they were distributing Bibles inside China, and that these were legally printed Bibles. He asked me if I would sponsor 1,000 Bibles. And I thought, well, certainly the partners of the Voice of China and Asia would not be opposed to that. And then I hung up the phone, and then immediately guilt hit me. I thought, what a fool I am. You cannot distribute Bibles legally inside China. What a joke. And I struggled with it for 3 days. And I finally called the guy back and said, look, if we're going to sponsor Bibles to be distributed in China, I need to be there to see him given out. And he said, come on. So, wow, it was that. There was the challenge. So we arranged to go to China. And lo and behold, we found out that in Nanjing, China, Nanjing at Amity Press, they print Bibles for the world there. I was just there in March, and I stood beside huge stacks of Bibles that said Kenya Bible Society. They ship Bibles to Latin America, to Africa. I've seen Norwegian Bibles, Russian Bibles, so many different languages, even the tribal languages inside China.
I'm smiling because we've all heard of made in China, but this is printed in China.
Printed in China, yeah.
Wow.
So I asked them, I said, well, if you know where the Bible, based on your Bible shipments, you probably know where the greatest revivals are in the world. And they said, yes, Latin America and Africa. Because even though they're a secular company, Amity Printing Press has captured the printing market for Bibles for the world.
How much does it cost to sponsor one Bible? Like, what does one Bible cost you when you purchase a Bible in Chinese to distribute?
Sure. In China, we say it's a three-way deal. You purchase... You don't want to just purchase a Bible and leave it on the dock, so you have to pay for transportation. And then you have to pay for the meetings to distribute the Bibles. Mm-hmm. Because when people come to one of your events in China, one of our events in China, they may walk 10 miles, and you don't want to send them home without feeding them. So to purchase, transport, and distribute a Bible costs about $6 U.S.
Per person.
Per person inside China, yeah.
Wow. Do you try to give one per family as a starting point versus one per individual?
We will give one per individual if other family members come. That's usually not an issue for us. You know, whoever's in the church service, everybody gets a Bible.
What translation is it?
It's interesting with the Chinese language that whether someone speaks Mandarin or they speak Cantonese, which is the language of southern China, they all read the same. So maybe they can't talk to each other, but they can write to each other. The words have the same meaning in both languages. So it's really interesting how the Lord's arranged that. No matter what you print in China, everybody can read it.
Okay, but is it translated from the King James or the
sure.
NIV, or which translation do you hand out?
The Bible we distribute is called the Chinese Union Version, or the CUV. And the CUV, as I told earlier about Robert Morrison, China knew they needed a new Bible. And so for 28 years, they worked on developing a new Bible based on the Greek and the Hebrew. And using the best Chinese scholars that they could, in 1919, they released the Union Version of the Bible. Now, that Bible is basically China's King James Bible.
Okay.
It is, people are so devoted to it. There are some, just like our King James Bible, we don't use the same words anymore like we used to in the King James Bible. And so they went to update the Chinese Union Version Bible in 2010. And but the rural people rejected it. They said, don't you touch our Bible. Don't you change a thing on the Bible. And so, yes, there is an updated language Bible called the New Chinese Union Version Bible, but the people reject it, and they don't want anybody touching their Bible.
Now, something I read about in your literature from the Voice of China and Asia Missionary Society is that it is not illegal to sell Bibles in a bookstore in China currently.
That's right.
But most of, now correct me if I'm wrong, because you know about China more than I do, but most of China is rural China, and they never make it to the city.
That's right. There's 600 million rural Chinese. If you go to China today, you will see the most beautiful cities. The major cities are wonderful, but China does not show you their poor side. And to be able to access rural China, even a lot of the city Chinese people don't know rural China exists. But you take the population of rural China, 600 million people, that's the total population of North and South America. That's just how many poor people there are inside rural China. The way they get their Bibles, we mentioned that they're available in bookstores. Only in the open registered church bookstores are Bibles available to be sold.
I see.
So they're printed at Amity Press, and 3 to 4 million Bibles every year are distributed out to 55,000 registered churches inside China, where anybody can go and buy one. You don't have to show your ID. You don't have to say, I go to this church, I don't go to this church. Any Chinese person can go in and buy one. But then you have to realize that's in the major cities. How are the rural people who earn maybe $3 a day, if that? That's a big income inside rural China. In fact, I've been told recently that almost 1 billion people earn less than $1,000 a year inside China. People cannot afford Bibles. And so that's why they don't distribute Bibles to these 600 million people in rural China. They don't have the money to pay for them.
Wow. Now, I also read in your literature that you don't just send boxes of Bibles over hoping that they make it into the hands of the people.
Yes, that's right. Yet we verify that the Bibles make it into the hands of the people. We have our representatives there who will go and verify that these things actually happen. We see the pictures, we get the reports back to them. So everything we do in China is verified.
In preparation for today's program, you sent me one of your newsletters, and it has pictures in it, and I love seeing the pictures of, in this case, a Chinese couple holding their own Bible. And this is Mr. and Mrs. Zhang, if I am pronouncing that correctly, and they live in a remote village in south central China. So tell us about that experience, which is, of course, just indicative of so many other experiences that have taken place over these past 100 plus years through your ministry.
It's really interesting, David, because China church growth is so strong. I asked a local leader, why is it that people, how is it that one area of the church had doubled in like 8 years? I said, how do you account for this doubling of the church? How is it that so many people are coming to the Lord? And he told me, everybody has experienced a miracle or they know somebody who has. So people like the Zhangs, Zhang, yeah, they can either experience a miracle or know somebody who has and accept the Lord, but never have access to a Bible. So they would have to fast, many fast and pray for years to own their own Bible. And that was the occasion for this couple here, that they just believed God that someday they would own a Bible. And a Voice of China and Asia representative was the one that put the Bible in their hands.
For them and others, it's a true red letter day.
Oh, that's true. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so, the next thing to happen is discipleship.
Yes.
So tell us how you are helping the new Christians of China be discipled.
Sure. Yeah. You have to realize that in rural China, there is no internet. There's probably, the people we deal with wouldn't have TV. They don't radio. Most likely no radio. They've got all evening to read their Bible. Some farmers will have a 6-week Bible reading plan. And after they plant their crop, they sit down and they read their Bible the entire Bible every 6 weeks until it's time to harvest. I mean, you don't have to disciple these people. The Word of God disciples them. If Americans would read or even Westerners in total would read their Bibles like the Chinese do, you'd see a phenomenal change.
So tell us how you are getting the good news out beyond Bible distribution.
Yes, I'm happy to do that. It's interesting. My wife and I were up in just out of Harbin years ago. This is probably about 2011. And we saw, it was a lady pastor up there. In fact, most of China's pastors are ladies. If the men become the pastors, then they'll most likely get arrested. But it's less likely for a woman to be arrested. And so if the husband gets arrested, the woman becomes a pastor anyway. So a lot of men support their wives in the ministry. And so we were up in an area, and there was a lady pastor. They were building a church, and we could see the mud brick forms that they were using to build this church. And I had $200 in my pocket. And I thought, you know what? With $200, I bet we could finish building this church. So I asked the lady, and I said, what is it that you really need? And she said, "We need training." I was dumbfounded, David, because it was the first mission field I'd been in the world where money was not the answer. She said, "We need training." So we went back to our coordinator, and in a year or so, we found out that there is a Chinese pastor study Bible. It's a 2,000-page study Bible that China allows to be distributed to their Chinese preachers because they know that there's absolutely no training for most of them. And if they're going to have any training in the Bible as a Christian leader, they need a training book. So this study Bible that we have here that we're looking at is printed. It wasn't printed for the communist pastors or anything. It was printed out of Hong Kong for Chinese ministers to have a good Chinese pastor study Bible. And so there's no political reference or bias or anything, and it is allowed to be printed legally inside China. And if somebody will sponsor these Bibles, which we will do, we can make sure that all the pastors, whenever we distribute Bibles, we make sure that all the pastors, leaders, Sunday school teachers have a pastor study Bible when we go out.
Well, that study Bible is quite a bit larger than the Chinese Bible that you brought today. So what's a concept that you would train a new, let's say, female pastor
Sure.
that she would then teach or preach to her congregation?
Yeah. Well, let me share a story, and then I'll answer the
Okay.
question. We were up another northeastern province, and a lady said, "I've been a pastor for 7 years, and I never knew how to put a sermon together." And so that was after she'd spent time with us. We spent an entire day showing them how to use this pastor study Bible to create sermons. So we show them what cross-references are. It looks too complicated for an uneducated minister, so they just read the scriptures from them. But if you show them what's so precious about the study Bible, like the cross-references, like all the notes at the bottom, and then we should introduce what a concordance is to them in the back of the Bible. And I like that part because I've often gotten to teach that and show them how you can actually teach on different subjects in the Bible. And then we say teach them 4 steps on how to prepare a sermon. And they just love it because they really are equipped.
And this is such a needed item because they cannot Google things like the modern pastors in the United States are doing to look up scriptures and things to, teaching things.
Sure.
But because you said there's internet access does not exist still in rural China.
That's right. I took a Chinese pastor with me to China. And he says, "Well, we don't need to teach them these things. They can get this on the internet." And I said, "Well, in the next time you speak, why don't you ask how many people have the internet?" And because I knew they didn't. I wanted him to see it. And so in China, people will respond because they want to be polite. And in being polite, there was probably out of a full audience, maybe 2 people raised their hand, and I think they raised their hand because they didn't understand the question, and they probably didn't understand what the internet was. So they need these study Bibles.
And how much does it cost to get one of these study Bibles in the hands of a pastor?
We can do that for $25.
Okay.
It's a 2,000-page study Bible. People here in the West can even get this same study Bible on the internet if they want, but they're probably going to pay $42 or more for it.
Wow. So again, the cost of one Bible to put in a person's hands is
$6
and one study Bible for the pastors
is $25.
$25.
Yeah,
So that's the way that people hook up with Voice of China in Asia.
that's right. Yeah, there's one more way if there's time.
Yeah, we're pretty short on time. I'm so enjoying this. You're going to come
Sure.
back at some point. But what is that way?
We found that also that many ministers are assigned, they work in the major church in the large cities, but then they're assigned certain areas, maybe a radius of 30 miles out from the church, and they've been walking out to these rural areas to little home churches and little churches out in the rural areas. That's their assignment. We call it heavenly real estate, and we started providing ministers motorcycles to get out there because they've been walking. Sometimes somebody will die, and they show up a day or 2 after the funeral because they just couldn't get there. Or if they take a bus, maybe there's one bus a day. And then they have to walk for miles once they're there.
Well, and it speeds up the spreading of the good news in China.
Absolutely. The people know that the pastor's going to show up for the service, so they start coming to church more often. And we've just given away our 1,000th motorcycle.
It's a circuit riding preacher, so to speak.
It is. There's just no horse involved.
Okay, give us your website before we say goodbye.
Sure. We're at voiceofchinaandasia.com. Spell all the words out. voiceofchinaandasia.com.
And the toll-free number to reach you guys
is at 877-392-0560.
That's 1-877-392-0560. Jonathan Brooks has been our special guest on today's Roadshow. Come back. We didn't get into the and Asia part of your ministry name. We just focused on China today. But wow, what an eye-opener today's program was. Thank you, Jonathan, for being with us. Well, for Jonathan Brooks, I'm David Warren, and it's been another great Roadshow. You've been listening to The Road Show. If you'd like to write to us, here's our address. The Road Show, P.O. Box 1924, Tulsa, Oklahoma, 74101. Our email address is roadshow@oasisnetwork.org. The views of today's guest aren't necessarily those of this station, but we do appreciate and thank our guest for spending this time with us. The Road Show, an Oasis Network presentation.